So good day everyone and welcome to another lesson here in Statistics and Probability. Our lesson for today is under tests on population mean, one sample z-test, and one sample t-test. Here are our first three main objectives to hit. Then we have our next 5 main objectives to hit. So in total, we have 8 main objectives to accomplish. And then we have 3 sub-objectives that we are also planning to accomplish. So in total, that's about 11 objectives. So given this situation, let's say that the father of a senior high school student lists down the expenses he will incur when he sends his daughter to university. He hypothesizes that the average tuition fee is at least 20,000 pesos per sem or per semester. The father asks at random 25 students of the university about their tuition per semester. He is able to get an average of 20,050 pesos with a standard deviation of 500 pesos. He assumes that the variable of interest follows a normal distribution with a known population mean and variance. Recalling on how to solve these types of problems, let's look at our 5 steps in hypothesis testing. We have tackled the first 2 steps, formulate the hypothesis, and to state the decision rule. For this lesson, we're going to tackle all 5 of them, including computing for the value of the test statistic, making a decision whether to reject or fail to reject the null hypothesis, and state the conclusion. So our step 1, from the given problem, our null hypothesis would be the average tuition fee in the targeted university is at least 20,000 pesos. So if we're having a null hypothesis of at least, our alternative hypothesis will have the symbol less than, since at least is the symbol greater than or equal to 20,000 pesos. For alternative hypothesis, we will have the average tuition fee in the targeted university is less than 20,000 pesos. So in symbols, our null hypothesis would be this. Your MU or mu is greater than or equal to 20,000 pesos, also read as mu is at least 20,000 pesos, meaning pinakamababa ang 20,000 pesos. And then, you have your alternative hypothesis where your mu is less than 20,000 pesos. Now, let's move to our step 2 in hypothesis testing, and that is to state your decision rule. So, these are the following decision rule guides if we are going to use the decision rule under t-test. If you're going to using the t-table, you're going to use t-test. So, this is the decision rule guide if we're going to undergo t-test by using our t-table. We have there the decision rule can be one of the following probabilities. 3 probabilities. The first one is to reject null hypothesis if the computed test statistic or TC is less than negative T sub A n minus 1 or the negative tabular value of T. So dahil negative tabular value of T yan, we're looking at the left-tailed distribution where your rejection region is on the left. Second one is to reject null hypothesis if your computed test statistic is greater than the positive tabular value. Kaya positive kasi we're looking on the right naman. So, ang rejection region mo nasa right tail. Third one, reject the null hypothesis if the absolute value of the computed test statistic is greater than the positive tabular value. Keep in mind that if you're going to use 2 tails, you need to divide first your alpha. So, hanapin mo yung tabular value mo sa negative and positive. Since naka-absolute value naman ang computed test statistic, you can just use your symbol greater than. So this test statistic follows the student's t-distribution table or student's t-table with n-1 degrees of freedom, which means that the tabular value in the student's t-table will be used as critical or tabular value. O pag sinabi natin critical value, yun yung value mo sa mga boundaries or tawag din yon for your tabular value, critical value. So your decision rule guides is always based on your rejection regions. Okay? So guide lang to kung paano gawin yung decision rule mo based ulit dun sa alternative hypothesis. Based from the guide, we can state our decision rule. Okay? So the first one, level of significance. Let's set the level of significance as 0.05. Alpha level 0.05, meaning our confidence level will be 95%. Next part is to determine the test statistic to use. Recalling, para malaman kung anong test statistic to use, look at your sample size. You have the sample size there of 25 from 25 students na in-interview nung tatay or nung father. So 25 students, this is a sample size of less than 30. So you're going to use t-test, your t-table. The next part is to determine your rejection region. Your rejection region depends on your alternative hypothesis. Since the symbol of your alternative hypothesis here is less than, we are going to have the first probability in the decision rule guide, where we are going to get the negative tabular value of t. That is going to be negative t sub a n minus 1, or negative t sub 0.05, 25 minus 1, 24. So our tabular value for that would be negative 1.711. So after determining your tabular value, let's now determine your rejection region. Since less than nga, so left-tailed. So ang rejection region mo falls on the left. Your critical value, meaning your tabular value, yung value between the boundary of your rejection region and acceptance region is negative 1.711. So our decision rule would be at alpha equals 0.05, reject null hypothesis if the computed test statistic is less than negative 1.711. Otherwise, we fail to reject the null hypothesis. So that is it for the first two steps. Let's now go on to the third step. So for our third step, there is a way to compute for the test statistic. So iba-iba ang formula. For this one, let's just look first at the t-test. So if we are going to use the t-test, we are going to use this formula. We have TC, computed test statistic, equal to your sample mean minus hypothesized mean. Ibig sabihin, kung ano yung nakuha mong mean from your sample, that's your sample mean. Your hypothesized mean is the mean that is, well, hypothesized. All over the fraction, sample standard deviation. Sa formula, ang denominator nito would be n minus 1. It can also be computed from your scientific calculators. Divided by the square root of n, or the square root of the sample size. So for our step 3, compute for the value of the test statistic. So dito, given naman lahat ng values ng variables natin, let's just look for it in our problem. So the first one to look for is the sample mean. So our sample mean from the problem is 20,050 pesos. Next, you have your hypothesized mean. The hypothesized mean of the father is 20,000 pesos. Next, you have your sample standard deviation. Keep in mind the word sample. So, standard dev ng sample mo, not the standard deviation of the population. We are looking at the sample standard dev. So, in our problem is already given, so there is no need to compute for the sample standard dev. You have there standard deviation S equals 500. And then the last one, you have your sample size. How many students you interviewed? That's 25 students. So, N equals 25. Substituting the values of the variables in the formula, you're going to have 20,050 sample mean minus 20,000, which is the hypothesized mean, all over the fraction 500 sample standard dev divided by square root of 25, or the square root of your sample size. Applying this whole expression into your calculator, the final answer would be 0.5. Now let's move to step 4, where we are going to make a decision whether to reject or fail to reject the null hypothesis. Recalling, we have our null and alternative hypothesis in symbols for step 1. For step 2, we have there the decision rule with the rejection region and the critical value of the rejection region. For step 3, we have the computed test statistic of 0.05. So for step 4, we are going to look at the previous 3 steps. So since the computed test statistic, TC, is 0.5, and the decision rule is TC less than negative 1.711 is 0.5, less than negative 1.711, we know that 0.5 is greater than negative 1.711. So, ibig sabihin nun, kung ito ang normal curve mo, nasa left ang rejection region mo. Yung computed mo would fall greater than. So, dito sa right nung critical value. So, this falls under the acceptance region, not the rejection region. So, yung walang kulay, doon siya nakalagay. Kasi nga, greater than negative 1.711. Thus, we fail to reject the null hypothesis. So, step 5 natin, we state the conclusion. So, our conclusion would be with the acceptance of the null hypothesis. Kasi nga, we fail to reject the null hypothesis. So, ibig sabihin, we accept. The father can say that the average tuition fee at the university per semester is at least 20,000 pesos. Okay, we are halfway there. As a way to celebrate our being in halfway, let's take a few moments to take a few deep breaths. Okay? So let's now go to the situation part 2. In this case, the father asks at random 36 students. So kanina 25 students, ngayon dinagdagan niya. 36 students naman ang tinanong about their tuition fee per semester. He is able to get an average of 19,850 with a standard deviation of 400 pesos. He assumes that the variable of interest follows a distribution with unknown population mean and variance. For step 1, we formulate the hypothesis. There is no difference between the hypothesis of the first situation to this situation, pareho lang. So our null would still be at least 20,000 and our alternative would be less than. So in symbols, that's first one natin greater than or equal to for our null, and then the second one for our alternative, we have the symbol less than. But there is something new na nagbago sa situation natin. That would be your 36 students sample size. Ibig sabihin, nag-increase yung sample size mo. So on our step 2, we are now going to look at the decision rule guides for t-test with the sample size large enough to invoke central limit theorem or CLT. So the decision rule guides are the following. This time, with the central limit theorem, we can assume that the test statistic follows the standard normal distribution, which means the tabular value in the z-table will be used as your critical value. So the decision rule guide can be one of the following probabilities. Pag ang alternative hypothesis mo ay less than, you are going to look at the first decision rule guide. So it would be reject null hypothesis if computed test statistic or TC is less than negative z sub a for one-tailed on the left. Next one, the second one is reject null hypothesis if the computed test statistic TC is greater than z sub a. So greater than, that's one-tailed on the right. Rejection region falls on the right. Then we have the third one, reject the null hypothesis if the absolute value of the computed test statistic is greater than z sub a over 2. The reason why it's a over 2 kasi we are looking at a two-tailed distribution. So we divide your alpha into 2. Isa sa left, isa sa right. So dalawang rejection regions. So moving to step 2 for our part 2 sa situation, we have there your level of significance being set as 0.05. Next, for the second part of our decision rule, the test statistic to use. Since our sample size is 36 students, which is greater than 30, technically we are going to use the z-test. However, it is not assumed to be a standard normal distribution. So kung naalala nyo kanina, ang inassume lang natin ay wala siyang population mean and population variance. Hindi natin sinabi na we are going to assume a standard normal distribution. So ganito yan. Pag inassume mo na standard normal distribution, diretso ka hanggang dulo, use your z-table. So you're going to do z-test. So in our case, we have a known population mean and variance. In our case, we have a known population mean and variance. In our case, we're going to use t-test or TC kahit ang sample size mo ay more than or equal to 30 because hindi natin inassume na it follows a normal distribution. So with this, since our alternative hypothesis is less than, we're looking at the left-tailed. So ang rejection region nasa left. So negative z sub a equals negative 1.645. So our critical value would be negative 1.645. Thus, our decision rule would be at alpha equals 0.05. We reject the null hypothesis if the computed test statistic is less than negative 1.645. Otherwise, we fail to reject the null hypothesis. The third step is to compute for the value of the test statistic looking at our problem. We can now identify the values of our variables. We have there the sample mean, which is 19,850. We have there the hypothesized mean of the population, which is 20,000 pesos. Then we have your sample standard deviation, which is 400. And then your sample size, or your n, which is 36. So substituting the values of the variables to the corresponding formula below, we now have 19,850 sample mean minus 20,000 hypothesized mean all over the fraction 400, which is your sample standard deviation, divided by the square root of n, or the square root of your sample size, square root of 36. Placing this expression in your scientific calculator, we will arrive at the answer, negative 2.25. For step 4, we are going to make a decision whether to reject or fail to reject the null hypothesis by looking at our previous 3 steps. Since the computed test statistic T sub C is negative 2.25 and the decision rule is T sub C less than negative 1.645, our computed test statistic is less than negative 1.645. So, ibig sabihin, it falls on the rejection region. It falls on the left of your critical value kasi nga, less than. So, thus, we reject the null hypothesis. For step 5, we are going to state the conclusion. If we have rejected the null hypothesis, our conclusion would be, with the rejection of the null hypothesis, the father can say that the average tuition fee at the university is less than 20,000 pesos. Okay, so here are the cases from the situations. So for case 1, the father assumes that the variable of interest follows a normal distribution with unknown population mean and variance. That falls under t-test. For case 2, that's the situation part 2, the father assumes that the variable of interest follows a distribution, not necessarily normal, with unknown population mean and variance. And then we have your last case, case 3 for z-test. The father assumes that the variable of interest follows a normal distribution with known population mean and variance. For the sample sizes of the following, for case 1, you have your sample size less than 30. For case 2, you have your sample size large enough to invoke central limit theorem or CLT. So, ibig sabihin nun, the sample size for your case 2 would be greater than or equal to 30. And then for your case 3, you have your sample size greater than or equal to 30. So, for the third case, here are the decision rule guides falling under z-test. For the decision rule guide, kung kanina, TC, computed test statistic pa rin to, pero Z sub C na, kasi nga Z-test na tayo. So, the decision rule can be one of the following possibilities. So, for the first one, reject null hypothesis if Z sub C is less than negative Z sub A. Second one, Z sub C greater than C sub A. And then for the third one, or the third probability, you have the absolute value of Z sub C greater than Z sub A over 2. Kung mapapansin nyo, there is always a pattern following this decision rule guides. How about the formula that we're going to use in computing for the test statistic under z-test? So the formula is as follows. Wala masyadong pinagkaiba dyan. Pinaka nagkaiba lang yan, your sample standard dev would now become your population standard dev, which will give us a formula of sample mean minus hypothesized mean all over the fraction population standard dev over the square root of your sample size. Yes, summary na! Na lang! So for our summary, let's wrap up what we have learned today. Our steps in hypothesis testing: formulate the hypothesis, state the decision rule, compute the value of the test statistic, make a decision whether to reject or fail to reject the null hypothesis, and then reject or fail to reject the null hypothesis, and then the last one is to state your conclusion. So here is the summary for the decision rule guides. So case 1, case 2, case 3. Case 1, t-test, n less than 30. Case 2, t-test. Your sample size is large enough to invoke central limit theorem. So your n greater than or equal to 30. For case 3, you have z-test, n greater than or equal to 30. So you can pause the video here to take note of this decision rule guides because you will be following these for your t-test and z-test. This is the summary for the test statistic guides. For case 1 and case 2, you're going to use the same formula. T sub C equals sample mean minus hypothesized mean divided by sample standard deviation over square root of the sample size. And then for case 3, you're going to use a different formula where your sample standard deviation would now become population standard deviation. So chapter 5, that is it for our lesson 4 under chapter 5. You have made it. I am proud of you. See you on our next lesson.